We're live.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started in another minute. Wait to give people a few more minutes to get here, another minute to get here. All right, let's get going tonight. I appreciate everyone who's been able to make time for this. My name is Mike Cummings, Superintendent of Fairfield Public Schools. I'm joined tonight by Andrea Clark, who is our Director of Communications. As we said earlier, if all your friends and relations can't make it tonight, this is going to be taped and the link will be available on the district website. It's really important to us that we gather as much information and your feedback and thoughts on the spending of the ARP ESSER funding. We're going to talk tonight. We're going to start with laying out some of the expectations for that funding. This will only take a few minutes, really. There'll be an opportunity for any questions related to ARP ESSER. And then Ms. Clark will give an explanation of how the thought exchange process works, which is the way that we'll gather your feedback and information, and which in that process, you'll also have opportunity to comment and rate the thoughts and ideas of others. So with that said, I'll get started. We have about 7 or 8 slides on ARP ESSER. There'll be an opportunity again for questions, and then we'll talk about the thought exchange process. So give me 1 minute. I just want to bring this up on my own computer. This is the third grant, and you're excused if you've lost track of the acronyms that have been used over the past almost year and a half around ARP ESSER or ARP and ESSER funding. The way this has worked, it is a federal funded program passed by Congress. We did go through the ESSER program. It wasn't known as ESSER 1 then because it was the only ESSER. And the funding for that was really about survival. So a lot of the funding there was to help districts, help towns replace funding that they had to put out, unbudgeted funds in response to COVID and the pandemic response. So that was ESSER 1. ESSER 2 was about thriving. So how might we, and this came out earlier this year, how might we use funding to respond to the conditions that the pandemic created? Primarily for education, this was directed around what was called initially learning loss, and now has been rephrased as unfinished learning. So what happened to students when schools were closed, when schools were in hybrid format, when schools might have been well open and students didn't have the opportunity to attend due to family circumstances. Again, federal funded program extended across all the United States. So in Fairfield, ESSER 2 funding was used primarily to fund the summer programs that we're putting in place to support students. And it's funding for both this summer and the summer of 2022. And we've put that grant in. We're in the process of identifying and signing up students for our summer school programs who were identified by academic need. And again, that funding is primarily directed at that need. So that was ESSER 2. ARP ESSER then came out. The funding came out and became available at the end of May. The grant application is due, at this point, we understand, mid-August. ARP ESSER is intended to transform. So how might a district, how might a town, and Fairfield, the town of Fairfield is also receiving ARP ESSER funds separate from the Fairfield Public Schools. How might the town and the schools use those funds to transform the work they do? And I bring this up now because I think this is really crucial as you start to think about the questions and ideas you want to contribute. And we'll give you a couple questions to help frame your thinking in a couple minutes. But the idea around these funds is essentially, how do we emerge from this as a stronger school system? So there are some requirements related to this, as we've discussed before in previous district communications. One of those expectations is that we complete the draft safe return to in-person learning and continuity of services plan, which is on our district website, and we need to finalize that by June 23rd. So that's been on the website for a couple weeks now. We're collecting feedback on it. We are going to use that feedback to finalize the document, and that will be posted on the website as a final document by June 23rd. Now, final here is it's not the exact right word. It's going to be the final draft for June 23rd's due date, but there are two things that are going to happen. There's going to be immediate changes in the document as the state changes its guidance around mitigation factors and other things that take place over the summer. So in response to any changes the state gives us, we'll update the document. Also, as part of the grant funding, that document needs to be looked at every 6 months and potentially edited again. So is the document current and up to date? And if not, the district needs to update it. And again, the timeline for that is at minimum every 6 months. In the grant, there is an expected allocation that 20% of the grant funding will be used to address this issue of learning loss or incomplete learning. So in Fairfield Public Schools, our total grant allocation, as you can see on the slide there, is $2,879,294. 20% of that, the 20% that we're going to have to allocate to address this incomplete learning, is $575,000. I'm not saying this at all right. $859, right? And that leaves a balance of $2,303,435 for other things. Now, you can exceed the 20% to address learning loss, but that's the minimum. And I will tell you that a couple of things we're looking at, since the ESSER 2 took care of the summer school programs for both this year and next. A couple of the ideas we're looking at for addressing learning loss would be things like after-school programs next year that would include something like transportation, so that we could make sure that students could access those programs. That's the type of thing that Fairfield might consider next year as we look at how to address these needs during the course of the school year. So the operative dollars is, again, around $2.3 million that we'll be allocate for your thinking tonight. Of course, I won't stop you from weighing in on how we might best address incomplete learning as well. So if that's one of your thoughts and you want to share that, please do so. A couple of the guidelines that we've developed internally as we think about this funding, I wanted to make sure I go over tonight. Now, these are just, at this point, guidelines. These are things that came out of the Fairfield Public Schools. These are not expectations necessarily within the grant application itself. But as we think about how we want to spend these funds, these are some of the principles that our district came up with. So when we really want to think about student-centered outcomes, we want to think about how, going back to the idea of transformation, how we're going to transform the expectations and learning for students, and how Fairfield schools might look different in 2.5 years in terms of those outcomes and expectations for students. So if you've got an idea that, it would be really great to build in service projects for our high school juniors, this would be a way to initiate that funding and possibly pilot a program. What we want to do is we want to also avoid funding cliffs. So one of the things that I heard several districts that I'm familiar with mention when this money first came up was, well, wouldn't it be great to buy computers for X, Y, and Z grades? The problem with that is, as we all know, is that in 4, 5, 6 years, those computers are all going to need to be replaced. And in 4, 5, 6 years, the ESSER funding, the ARP ESSER funding will have expired. So at some point, when those devices need to be replaced, they're going to fall on a district budget. And so one of the things that we're trying to do when we think about these things is how we would avoid those types of cliffs whenever possible. It may not be possible to do it everywhere, but I think it's one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we make the final decisions. Again, the idea that the 20% of the funding has to be put towards learning, incomplete learning, learning needs, and know that the grant has to be totally expended by September of 2024. So about 39, 40 months from now, we've got to expend out the $2.8 million and close out the grant. The state, in its work to support the districts with the funding, has identified these 5 priorities: learning acceleration, academic renewal, and student enrichment, family and community connections, social, emotional, and mental health of the students and of the school staff, strategic use of technology, staff development in the digital divide, and building safe and healthy schools. It's an example like that, and I've heard several people, especially driven by the weather this past week, have asked me if funding could be used for air conditioning. It could certainly be used for air conditioning if that's something that we ultimately decide that we should spend some money on. But those are the types of things that the state essentially is dividing the funding into these 5 buckets, and the application is written in such a way that we align our funding into these 5 buckets. It's not expected that you have to put money into every bucket. So I want to be clear. We don't have to necessarily put the money, we don't have to cover our bases or all 5 bases here. We can pick from these 5, but these are the 5 buckets that the state asks us to kind of develop planning around when we put our application in. There is a possibility that we're not averse to spending $10,000 on a single item, for example. We're not averse to spending, monies that might be less than that. So I don't want you to think that necessarily we have to be thinking in terms of big projects that cost a lot of money. There are some small items that are attractive and will cost less money, and we will certainly spend the time including in the grant if there's consensus that something like that should be included. So Andrew, yeah, there we go. So just a couple questions to kind of think about. These are big picture questions that you can think about as we think about the funding. And I used these similar questions when we began this conversation with our administrators about 3 or 4 weeks ago to get them thinking around the same process. What do we need to do so that by the beginning of the 24-25 school year, we are a better school system? What is something we always knew we needed to do, but never had time? And I should add to that, and money. So this could be, again, a relatively smaller project, but we've just never been able to get it done. We haven't had the time to get it done, and we haven't had the funding to get it done. And sometimes that may be, and it could function in such a way that we would, it's a relatively small enough project that we need to hire somebody to do it for us as part of the grant funding. And then finally, going back to this important word, how does this funding transform Fairfield Public Schools? So that's the end of the explanation or the overview of the ARP ESSER funding. I don't know if there's any questions on ARP ESSER before we start to talk about the process in which we're going to get your thoughts and ideas.
Some people are putting suggestions for the funding into the chat, which we're going to ask them to redirect to the thought exchange process, but I'm not seeing any questions specifically about the guidelines.
Okay, we'll give it a minute here in case any questions. While we're waiting, I just want to remind folks that, again, we appreciate the fact that you're here tonight with us to do this in person or virtually in person. But if you know of folks who cannot engage in this tonight, this is going to be available on the website. The link, this process is being recorded. People can access it. They can fast forward through me, but they can get to the thought exchange process, which is the most important part of this. And it'll be on the website and available through June 21st. Any questions?
Not seeing any questions.
All
so
right.
Let's get on to the
let's talk about thought exchange. Thank you.
Okay. Some of you may be familiar with the process because we've actually started using it with the Safe Return Plan. There are 3 steps to the process in terms of getting feedback. The first is where you share your ideas, your thoughts in answer to the questions that we've posed. Then you get to rate the thoughts of others that are randomly put in front of you. And you can rate as many or as few as you want. And then you do have the opportunity as thoughts are coming in to see what is most important to the group. We very much want your input and your thoughts on how we should be spending the funding. But one of the really valuable parts of using Thought Exchange is that by rating the thoughts of other people, we get to see what's important to the community as a whole. So that's a very important step for us. I'm going to jump out of the presentation slides and actually take you into the thought exchange so that you can see, how this is going to work. So there we go. If you have access to a device, you can go to tejoin.com, and that you will be asked to enter in a 9-digit code, which is the code that you see on the screen. Again, we're going to give you a link directly to this on the website if you don't do it right this minute, which is fine. When you go to the website, you will see a welcome screen, which will have the opening questions on it. How do you think we should use the ARP ESSER grant funding to transform Fairfield Public Schools? Consider what we need to do so that by the beginning of the 2024-25 school year, we are a better school system. What's something we always knew we needed to do, but never had the time? That's the framing question. You then click enter. Now, we're asking you to put your ideas into the 5 priority buckets that the state has indicated. So before you get to submit an idea, we're going to ask you to choose the funding priority about which you want to share your ideas. So if you look at the drop-down menu, all 5 are listed there. You pick which one you want, whether it's about academics, family and community, social emotional, technology, or building safe and healthy schools. And that way you will be rating other people's ideas around the same topic so that we can look at priorities within each of these buckets. So you pick a section, you hit next. It explains to you that you'll see an introduction. There is one quick question that we're going to ask just so that we know if participants are residents or families or employees. You have the opportunity to share your thoughts and then rate them, and then you'll get to see, as ideas are shared, what's important to the group. You click on next. There's an introduction here that basically tells you what I've just been telling you about how you do this. If you haven't, if you're watching this video as a recording and you haven't seen it, we're asking that you do watch it so that you understand what the parameters are before you get into this. The really valuable part, again, is rating other people's ideas. So even if you have a chance tonight to submit your ideas, we'd ask you to come back in a day or two and look at other people's ideas, which may have been added in the meantime, so that you get to rate those as well. If you want to share ideas on a different topic than the one that you initially picked, all you have to do is go back to the welcome screen, or you can actually scroll back up and hit go again, and you get another opportunity to pick a different topic and say go. Okay. For some reason, it always asks you to do that twice. Not really sure why. We go through the introduction. You click next. This is the one question just so that we can identify what bucket you're in, parent, families, students, employees, and residents. We want to make sure we have fair representation from all groups. You click next, and then it asks you to put your first idea in. Okay, and there is a character limit, so tell us where you think, what we should spend the funding on, and then why you think that's important. If you have more than one idea, you'll have an opportunity to submit that separately. So if we want to spend the money on tutoring, and we think it's important to make up for learning loss, okay, then we submit it. You have an opportunity to submit a second thought. You can do a third, a fourth, as many ideas as you have. It'll let you keep going for as many ideas as you want. Once you're done sharing, you click on that, and then it will give you the opportunity. It will randomly present other thoughts in that bucket that have been presented to you. Now, obviously, people have not yet had an opportunity to share ideas yet, so we don't have enough. When there is an idea, you just simply indicate how many stars you give it. 1, you don't think it's important. 5, you think it's very important, and it'll remind you how to do that, and you can continue through. Again, anytime you want to go back and start over, you can go back to the welcome screen and go back up and click a different bucket that you'd like to be in submitting ideas on. Once you've gone all the way through that process and you've rated as many ideas as you've submitted the thoughts that you have, you've rated the ideas of others, there is an opportunity to see the other thoughts that have come up. And so you can be looking at that while you're working too. And then when you're done, you just hit complete exchange and everything's been submitted. So if there are no further questions on the process, I'm going to just go back to the screen that actually has the code on it, so that if anybody's interested in getting started now, we can do that. And that's basically how the process works.
Andrew, is there I think I saw, are there any questions now? I think I saw a question about, I think it was related to remote learning, but it was a question around, are there any limits on what people can put in for ideas? And the answer to that is no. I mean, as long as it's educationally related, although if you want to spend the city money, we'll happily forward that over. But as long as it's educationally related and your idea is that you'd like to have us spend some money on remote learning, please put that in. I mean, we're not holding back, and this really is truly about brainstorming ideas. So the ideas that are important to you, we want to hear about. Were there any other questions there that we should, before we end tonight?
No, I'm not seeing any questions on process or guidelines. Again, for the folks who've put suggestions for spending the funding in the chat, we just ask that you please go to the TE join link and put them in there, and we'll have an opportunity to collect them that way.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. We really appreciate your ideas, and the more ideas we get, the more we'll have to respond to. So, any encouragement you get folks to join us on this, it would be much appreciated. Thank you. Have a good night.